Have you ever opened an old cookbook and felt like you were peeking into another world? Back in the 1950s through the 1970s, Betty Crocker wasn't just a name, it was America's kitchen companion. Her recipes shaped what families ate at the dinner table, especially when supper wasn't just about food, but about comfort, tradition, and the warmth of gathering together after a long day. Today, most of those recipes have completely vanished from our kitchens. Dishes that once filled entire neighborhoods with rich aromas now survive only in faded pages and handwritten recipe cards tucked away in dusty drawers. Meals like hearty casseroles, creamy tetrazzinis, and skillet suppers weren't just quick solutions, they were staples of family life. They told a story of resilience, of mothers stretching every dollar, and of communities tied together by shared flavors. But here's the thing, each of these forgotten suppers holds more than just ingredients. They hold memories. The clatter of Pyrex dishes, the steam rising from the oven, kids rushing to the table, and families finding comfort in meals that were simple, filling, and made with love. In this video, we're uncovering 10 old Betty Crocker suppers nobody cooks anymore, recipes that once defined American family dinners but have slowly disappeared from our tables. Some are quirky, some are hearty, and some might even surprise you with their creativity. So, if you love the taste of nostalgia and want to rediscover the dishes that shaped generations, you're in the right place. Stick with me, and let's step back into the kitchens of mid-century America. And hey, don't forget to subscribe, because together we're bringing back the flavors history almost forgot. When it came to true comfort food, few dishes could compete with Betty Crocker's chicken and dumpling casserole. This wasn't just dinner, it was a hug in a dish. Picture the scene, it's a chilly evening in the 1950s, the family gathers around the kitchen table, and from the oven comes a bubbling casserole that fills the room with the aroma of tender chicken, creamy gravy, and soft, pillowy dumplings. This casserole was born from two traditions. First, the old-fashioned chicken stew with dumplings that had roots in rural America, where families stretched one bird to feed many mouths. And second, the mid-century obsession with casseroles, meals designed to be hearty, convenient, and big enough for leftovers. Betty Crocker combined those traditions and gave homemakers a recipe that felt both classic and modern, a dish that celebrated thrift without sacrificing comfort. The dumplings themselves were often made from biscuit dough, spooned right on top of the bubbling casserole so they steamed into fluffy, golden-topped clouds. Beneath them, chunks of chicken were nestled in a rich sauce thickened with broth, milk, and sometimes a splash of cream of mushroom soup, because in the 1960s, no casserole was complete without it. What made this dish so beloved wasn't just the flavor, but the ritual. It was the sight of Mom pulling a heavy Pyrex dish from the oven, the sound of spoons clinking as everyone dug in, and the way it warmed both stomach and spirit after a long day. Today, casseroles may feel old-fashioned, but chicken and dumpling casserole remains a perfect reminder of how simple ingredients could create unforgettable meals. It was more than supper, it was home, baked into every bite. In the mid-20th century, the tuna and rice skillet was one of Betty Crocker's cleverest answers to the eternal question, what's for supper? Quick, filling, and budget-friendly, this one-pan wonder became a weeknight hero for families stretching their dollars while still wanting something that felt hearty and complete. Tuna was the star, an ingredient that gained immense popularity during World War II and continued into the post-war years. It was shelf-stable, affordable, and packed with protein, making it a pantry essential in almost every American home. Pair it with rice, another inexpensive staple, and suddenly you had a dish that could feed the whole family without breaking the bank. Betty Crocker's version usually started with onions sizzling in a skillet, mixed with rice that absorbed both flavor and texture. Tuna was stirred in along with cream of celery or mushroom soup, giving the dish a creamy base that tied everything together. Peas or carrots often made an appearance too, adding a pop of color and a hint of sweetness. And of course, it was topped with just a sprinkle of shredded cheese or breadcrumbs, because in the 1960s, no comfort dish was complete without a golden finish. What families loved most about the tuna and rice skillet wasn't just its taste, but its practicality. It was a supper you could make in less than half an hour, with ingredients already on hand. For working parents and busy households, it was a lifesaver. Though it's rarely seen on dinner tables today, the tuna and rice skillet is a snapshot of an era when creativity in the kitchen wasn't about fancy ingredients, but about turning simple pantry items into something truly satisfying. It was humble, yes, but it was also pure comfort in a pan. Few dishes captured the heart of mid-century America quite like Betty Crocker's beef and macaroni bake. It was the kind of supper that brought everyone to the table, no questions asked. Think of it as the cozy cousin of lasagna, less fancy, more practical, but every bit as comforting. This dish rose to fame in the 1950s and 60s, during the golden age of casseroles. Families needed meals that could stretch a pound of ground beef into something filling, affordable, and kid-approved. Enter elbow macaroni, cheap, cheerful, and always sitting in the pantry. Together, beef and pasta became the foundation of a dish that fed families through school nights, cold winters, and leaner times. Betty Crocker's version began with ground beef browned in a skillet, mixed with tomato sauce or canned soup, and seasoned just enough to give it a home-style kick. Cooked macaroni was folded in, creating a hearty base. And then came the part everyone loved, a blanket of shredded cheese on top. Baked until golden and bubbling, the casserole emerged from the oven smelling like pure comfort. What made the beef and macaroni bake truly special was its adaptability. Moms could toss in leftover vegetables, swap sauces, or sprinkle breadcrumbs for extra crunch. It wasn't just a recipe, it was a canvas for creativity, one that still delivered a dependable, satisfying supper every time. For kids, it was the ultimate comfort food. For parents, it was quick, economical, and guaranteed to silence the question, "What's for dinner?" And while today it may feel overshadowed by trendier dishes, the beef and macaroni bake remains a symbol of a simpler era, when family, flavor, and practicality all baked together in one casserole dish. Back in the days when no part of a meal was ever wasted, chicken croquettes were a shining example of Betty Crocker's ability to turn leftovers into something extraordinary. This dish wasn't just supper, it was ingenuity dressed in golden breadcrumbs. Croquettes actually trace their roots to European cooking, but by the mid-20th century, Betty Crocker had brought them right into the heart of American kitchens. For homemakers, they were the perfect solution to a common dilemma: what to do with leftover roasted or boiled chicken. Rather than reheating scraps, those pieces were chopped fine, mixed with breadcrumbs, seasonings, sometimes cream or egg, and shaped into little patties or ovals. The magic happened in the frying pan. As the croquettes sizzled in hot oil, their crispy exterior formed a satisfying crust while the inside stayed moist, tender, and flavorful. Served with a drizzle of gravy or a dollop of cream sauce, they looked fancy enough for company but were simple enough for a Tuesday night dinner. What made chicken croquettes such a beloved dish was the balance they struck: economical yet elegant, practical yet special. They spoke to a generation of homemakers who took pride in making something delicious out of almost nothing. The very act of shaping croquettes by hand carried a sense of care, each one pressed and rolled with love before hitting the skillet. At the table, croquettes were more than just a way to stretch chicken, they were a way to create joy. Crispy on the outside, comforting on the inside, they offered families a supper that felt like a treat. Today, They are rarely seen outside vintage cookbooks, but their story reminds us that resourcefulness was once the secret ingredient to unforgettable meals. Few dishes speak hearty quite like Betty Crocker's pork and bean casserole. In an era when families wanted suppers that were both filling and frugal, this dish became a staple of the American table. It wasn't glamorous, but it was deeply satisfying, the kind of meal that filled bellies and warmed kitchens on long, busy nights. Casseroles were the crown jewel of mid-century cooking, and this one stood out because it married two pantry essentials, pork and beans. Canned pork and beans had been popular since the early 20th century, offering families a ready-made mix of protein and flavor. Betty Crocker took that idea and transformed it into something bigger, a bubbling dish that could serve the whole family. The casserole usually started with browned ground pork or sometimes strips of bacon layered into a dish. Then came the beans, slow-simmered or straight from the can, mixed with ketchup, molasses, or brown sugar for that iconic sweet and savory punch. A topping of breadcrumbs or crispy onions often sealed the deal, giving it both crunch and comfort. What made the pork and bean casserole so beloved was its flexibility. Families could swap in what they had, different cuts of pork, extra vegetables, or whatever spices were handy. And because it baked all together in one dish, cleanup was minimal, a blessing for busy homemakers. Around the table, this casserole carried more than flavor. It carried a sense of togetherness, a reminder that even the humblest ingredients could create something nourishing. For kids, it was a sticky, saucy treat. For parents, it was a budget stretcher that still felt like a feast. Today, it's rare to see pork and bean casserole on menus, but in Betty Crocker's era, it was a weeknight champion, practical, hearty, and undeniably comforting. In the world of Betty Crocker suppers, few dishes felt as special as the shrimp and noodle bake. At a time when seafood wasn't an everyday dinner choice for most families, this casserole carried an air of elegance, something you might serve when company was coming or when you wanted to turn an ordinary evening into something memorable. Shrimp had long been considered a treat, but by the mid-20th century, improvements in freezing and distribution made it more accessible to households across America. Betty Crocker tapped into that excitement, offering recipes that made shrimp not just a luxury, but part of weeknight cooking. The shrimp and noodle bake was one of her cleverest creations. The dish usually began with egg noodles, boiled until just tender. They were then layered into a casserole with shrimp, cream of mushroom or celery soup, and a splash of milk, creating a creamy base that clung to every bite. Cheese often melted over the top, while a scattering of breadcrumbs gave it a golden, crunchy finish. Some variations even added pimentos or peas for color, because in Betty's kitchen, every dish had to look as cheerful as it tasted. Families loved this casserole because it felt like a little luxury disguised as practicality. It stretched a modest amount of shrimp into a full supper, feeding a whole family without emptying the wallet. For kids, it was creamy comfort. For parents, it was proof that supper could be both thrifty and special. Though shrimp casseroles have mostly disappeared from modern tables, the shrimp and noodle bake remains a delicious snapshot of a time when Betty Crocker helped bring a taste of the sea into America's heartland kitchens, one bubbling casserole dish at a time. Few suppers captured the soul of mid-century comfort quite like Betty Crocker's ham and scalloped potatoes. It was the kind of dish that smelled like Sunday afternoons, filling the kitchen with aromas so warm and rich that even before it hit the table, everyone knew it was going to be a feast. This casserole carried roots in old farmhouse cooking, where nothing ever went to waste. Leftover ham from a holiday meal or Sunday roast often became the centerpiece of weekday suppers. Betty Crocker turned that tradition into a dependable recipe, teaching homemakers how to transform scraps into something that felt abundant and celebratory. The dish began with thinly sliced potatoes, layered carefully in a baking dish. Between those layers went chunks of ham, onions, and a creamy white sauce often made with milk, butter, and flour. As it baked, the potatoes softened, the ham infused its smoky flavor, and the sauce thickened into a silky blanket that bound everything together. A sprinkling of cheese or breadcrumbs on top gave it that irresistible golden crust. What made ham and scalloped potatoes truly beloved was how it combined practicality with a sense of occasion. It was economical, stretching leftovers into another full meal, but it never felt like second best. Instead, it felt like a reward, a dish that turned ordinary nights into something special. Around the table, families dug in with gratitude. Kids loved the creamy potatoes, parents appreciated the thriftiness, and together they shared a dish that symbolized both resourcefulness and comfort. Today, we might see scalloped potatoes as a side dish, but in Betty Crocker's kitchen, paired with ham, it was supper at its finest, warm, hearty, and full of mid-century charm. Among Betty Crocker's classic suppers, few dishes carried as much elegance as turkey tetrazzini. With its creamy sauce, tender turkey, and golden crust, it was a casserole that felt just a little more refined, like something you might serve to guests, yet simple enough for an ordinary weeknight. The origins of tetrazzini actually stretch back to the early 20th century, named after an Italian opera singer and first popularized in restaurants. But by the 1950s and 60s, Betty Crocker brought it right into American kitchens, adapting it into an accessible, family-friendly dish. For homemakers staring at piles of leftover Thanksgiving turkey, this recipe was nothing short of a lifesaver. The dish started with spaghetti or egg noodles, cooked and layered into a casserole dish. Turkey chunks were folded in with a creamy base, often made from cream of mushroom soup, milk, and a little broth for richness. Peas or mushrooms frequently appeared, giving pops of color and earthiness. A topping of grated cheese or buttered breadcrumbs ensured that irresistible golden finish once baked. Families loved turkey tetrazzini not only for its flavor but for its cleverness. Leftover turkey, which might otherwise feel repetitive after a holiday feast, was reborn into something completely different, comforting, filling, and just indulgent enough to feel special. In many homes, it became a tradition after big gatherings, stretching one bird across multiple memorable meals. At the table, it offered both practicality and pleasure. Kids twirled noodles on their forks while parents appreciated the creativity of a dish that blended thrift with elegance. Today, it's rare to see turkey tetrazzini outside of vintage cookbooks, but in Betty Crocker's day, it stood as a shining example of how American families turned leftovers into a centerpiece, creamy, hearty, and unforgettable. If there was ever a supper that defined hearty, all-American comfort, it was Betty Crocker's beef stew casserole. Born from the tradition of slow-simmered stews, this version captured all the flavor of a pot left on the stove all day, yet reimagined in casserole form, perfect for the oven-loving kitchens of the 1950s and 60s. Beef stew had long been a farmhouse staple, but Betty Crocker transformed it into something more convenient and casserole-friendly. Instead of simmering for hours, homemakers could layer the key elements, beef, vegetables, and gravy, into a single dish, top it with a crust or potatoes, and let the oven do the work. The result was a bubbling, savory meal that smelled like pure comfort the moment the door opened. Chunks of beef, browned for richness, were mixed with carrots, peas, and onions, all swimming in a thick gravy often built from broth and cream of mushroom soup. Sometimes potatoes were layered inside, other times mashed and spread across the top like a pie crust, giving the dish a shepherd's pie twist. No matter the variation, it was filling, flavorful, and designed to stretch ingredients for maximum value. Families adored beef stew casserole because it combined tradition with convenience. It tasted like the Sunday suppers their grandparents knew, yet it fit neatly into the mid-century love for casseroles, big enough to feed a family, sturdy enough to leave leftovers, and simple enough for even the busiest homemaker to prepare. At the table, it carried the same magic as a stew simmered all day: warmth, nourishment, and a sense of being cared for. Though rarely seen today, beef stew casserole remains a delicious reminder of how Betty Crocker helped America turn old-fashioned comfort into oven-baked tradition. In the world of quick and dependable suppers, Betty Crocker's chicken and rice skillet was a true hero. It was the kind of dish that appeared on countless weeknight tables during the 1950s and 60s, proving that with just a skillet and a few pantry staples, a comforting meal was never far away. Rice had long been celebrated as a budget-friendly staple, and paired with chicken, it became the backbone of countless family dinners. Betty Crocker elevated that pairing by turning it into a one-pan wonder, easy to prepare, easy to clean up, and hearty enough to satisfy everyone around the table. The dish usually started with chicken pieces browned in a skillet until golden. Rice was added next, soaking up all the flavor from the sizzling meat. Broth, milk, or even a can of cream soup would be poured in to create a creamy, savory base that tied the dish together. Often, peas, carrots, or celery were stirred in, giving both color and nutrition. Everything simmered gently until the rice was tender and the chicken perfectly cooked, filling the kitchen with the kind of aroma that promised warmth and comfort. What made the chicken and rice skillet so beloved was its balance of simplicity and heartiness. It didn't require fancy ingredients or long hours in the kitchen, just the kind of basics every family kept on hand. For busy parents, it was a lifesaver; for kids, it was pure comfort on a plate. Today, skillet suppers have taken a backseat to quicker convenience foods, but the chicken and rice skillet remains a reminder of an era when dinner was about more than speed. It was about gathering, sharing, and finding joy in the everyday act of cooking together. And there we have it, 10 suppers straight from Betty Crocker's golden era, each one a snapshot of the kitchens that defined mid-century America. From creamy casseroles to skillet favorites, these weren't just recipes, they were memories. They told the story of families gathered around formica tables, of Pyrex dishes steaming fresh from the oven, and of mothers and fathers stretching simple ingredients into meals that somehow always felt like feasts. What's striking about these forgotten suppers is how deeply they were woven into daily life. They weren't showpieces or gourmet experiments. They were practical, reliable, and made with what was on hand. And yet, they carried so much love. A bubbling casserole or a skillet of rice and chicken wasn't just dinner, it was reassurance. It was the comfort of knowing that no matter how hard the day had been, something warm and filling was waiting at the table. Today, our meals may look different, faster, or more modern, but revisiting these dishes reminds us that food has always been about more than just sustenance. It's about connection. It's about tradition. And it's about remembering the generations who came before us, making the most out of what they had, and creating joy in the process. So, if this trip down memory lane stirred up nostalgia, or maybe even inspired you to try one of these forgotten suppers in your own kitchen, don't let the story end here. Subscribe to the channel and join me as we continue to uncover the recipes America left behind. Because sometimes, the best way to move forward is to taste the past one more time.